April 27th, 26th, Rzeszów, Poland. An international arms exhibition, military officials, defense analysts, and journalists from across Europe. New drones hovered in glass cases. Radar systems rotated under bright lights. Armored vehicles lined the hall. But none of them held the room the way one display suddenly did. At the center of a crowded stand sat something few Ukraine could reveal so soon. A sleek mock-up of a ballistic missile painted with the Ukrainian flag, developed by a company called Firepoint, a name almost unknown before the full-scale invasion. The missile carried a simple designation. Then visitors looked at the specifications. Maximum range, 855 kilometers. 855 kilometers. The number spread through the exhibition hall. People reached for their phones. Others checked maps. Because everyone immediately understood what it meant. A straight line distance from Kiev to Moscow is roughly 750 kilometers. This missile was not built for symbolism. It was built with reach. Ukraine had just unveiled a weapon theoretically capable of striking the Russian capital. And that was only the first shock. The card listed maximum speed at around 2,100 meters per second, roughly Mach 6.5, hypersonic territory, faster than many systems currently in service around the world, comparable to Russia's Iskander-M missile system, one of Moscow's most heavily promoted battlefield weapons, faster than the American ATAC-MS system that Ukraine had spent years requesting from Washington. For many observers, that comparison mattered most. Ukraine had long depended on foreign approval for long-range strikes. Western systems often came with restrictions. Targets had to be approved, distances were limited, political calculations in distant capitals could shape battlefield options overnight. But the FP9 represented something entirely different. This was not a loaned capability. It was not a donated stockpile. It was not subject to foreign hesitation. It was Ukrainian-designed, Ukrainian-produced, and according to its developer, entering mass production this summer. That changes the strategic picture immediately. To understand why, look at Ukraine's progression since 2022. In the early months of the war, Ukraine's strike capability inside Russia was limited. Artillery and shorter-range rockets could reach only nearby military positions. High-value targets deeper inside Russian territory remained largely untouched. Then came HIMARS, but even that depended on what ammunition was approved and when. Later, Storm Shadow missiles extended reach to around 300 kilometers, allowing more ambitious operations. Yet those systems were still foreign-supplied and politically constrained. Then, in early 2026, came another surprise. Reports emerged that the FP5 Flamingo, another Ukrainian system, had struck the Votkinsk missile factory approximately 1,400 kilometers away. That attack signaled something profound. Ukraine was no longer just defending its skies or front lines. It was developing the means to threaten Russia's industrial base itself. Now, standing in Poland, the FP9 sends a second message. Ukraine is building a domestic missile industry at wartime speed, and that may be even more important than the missile's range. Wars are not won by prototypes, they are shaped by production. Russia has relied on mass missile attacks for years, using large inventories and sustained output to pressure Ukrainian infrastructure and morale. If Ukraine can now produce long-range ballistic missiles in meaningful numbers, Moscow faces a problem it has not fully confronted before: reciprocal pressure. Air bases, logistics hubs, command centers, rail choke points, and military factories once assumed safe by distance may no longer be safe at all. Even if the FP9 is used primarily as deterrence, its existence forces Russia to adapt. More air defenses must be moved inward, more resources must be spent protecting rear areas. More uncertainty enters every planning cycle. That alone can reshape a war. There is also a psychological dimension impossible to ignore. Since 2022, Russian missiles have repeatedly struck Ukrainian cities far from the front. The perception inside Russia was that geography offered insulation. Distance meant security. The FP9 challenges that assumption. No capital likes vulnerability, no military planner likes surprise, and no state wants an opponent rapidly closing a technological gap during wartime. Critics will note that exhibition mock-ups are not battlefield proof. That is true. Real production numbers, reliability, interception rates, and operational doctrine all matter more than a display stand. But weapons programs are often revealed publicly for a reason: to signal readiness, to influence adversary calculations, and to shape expectations before the first launch. If that was the goal in Rzeszów, it worked, because one specification card changed the tone of the room. 855 kilometers. Mach 6.5. Mass production this summer. For 4 years, the story of this war was often about what weapons Ukraine hoped others would send. Now, increasingly, the story may become what weapons Ukraine can build itself. And if that shift is real, then the unveiling of the FP9 may be remembered as more than an exhibition moment. It may be remembered as the moment distance stopped protecting Russia. The story of how Ukraine went from striking targets 100 kilometers away to threatening sites near Moscow in just 4 years is one of the most remarkable wartime technology transformations in modern history. In 2022, Ukraine's reach was limited. Most attacks depended on artillery, rockets, or foreign systems with strict political limits. Deep targets inside Russia were largely beyond reach. By 2026, that picture had changed dramatically. The Kremlin understood what each stage of that evolution meant. Every increase in range was more than a technical achievement. It was a shrinking buffer zone. Every new system meant factories, airfields, command centers, and logistics hubs, once considered secure, were becoming vulnerable. Yet, despite understanding the danger, Russia had no clear way to stop the process, because Ukraine was no longer waiting for permission. It was building. That reality became impossible to ignore in late February, when Ukraine carried out one of the most significant strikes of the war. Using domestically produced FP-5 Flamingo cruise missiles, Ukrainian forces reportedly hit the Votkinsk complex deep inside Russia. This was not just another distant target. Votkinsk is one of the most strategically important defense production sites in the country. It manufactures weapons Russia has used throughout the war. The strike marked the first time Ukraine had successfully targeted a major Russian defense industry facility with long-range missiles made inside Ukraine itself. President Volodymyr Zelensky publicly emphasized the significance of the moment, saying Ukraine had carried out precise strikes with Flamingo missiles at a range of 1,400 kilometers, calling it a major success for Ukrainian industry. And he was right to highlight industry, because the real headline was not only that the target was hit, it was that Ukraine had built the tool that hit it. The symbolism could hardly have been sharper. For years, Russian missiles launched from secure rear areas had targeted Ukrainian cities, energy grids, bridges, and apartment buildings. Now a Ukrainian-built missile had reached the factory, producing some of those same weapons. The Votkinsk complex is associated with production of systems such as the Iskander ballistic missile, cruise missile components, and other strategic weapons infrastructure. In practical terms, that means Ukraine did not simply strike a warehouse or isolated fuel depot. It targeted a node tied directly to Russia's ability to sustain missile warfare. That changes perceptions on both sides. Inside Ukraine, it demonstrated self-reliance under wartime pressure. Inside Russia, it challenged the assumption that industrial depth guarantees safety. Distance had long protected critical facilities, but 1,400 kilometers is not symbolic reach. It is strategic reach. And the Flamingo appears to be more than a one-off experiment. Reports suggest a maximum range of around 3,000 kilometers with a payload exceeding 1,000 kilograms. If accurate, that would place it in an entirely different category from many long-range drones used earlier in the war. Drones have often been effective for disruption. They can force air defense responses, damage infrastructure, and create uncertainty. But smaller payloads limit their effect against hardened or industrial-scale targets. Cruise missiles with heavier warheads are different. They can threaten reinforced facilities, production halls, fuel storage, rail junctions, and command structures with a level of destructive potential drones often cannot match. They also force defenders to spend more expensive interceptors and maintain broader alert coverage. This is where the Kremlin's problem becomes clear. Stopping one strike is difficult enough. Stopping an industrial learning curve is harder. Ukraine's development path shows a pattern. First came improvised adaptation, then extended-range drone campaigns, then domestic cruise missile success, then public unveiling of systems like the FP-9 ballistic missile. Each phase builds on the last. Engineering teams gain experience. Supply chains improve. Guidance systems mature. The computational demand of tracking, targeting, and intercepting a hypersonic range ballistic missile is at the absolute limit of what existing Russian air defense systems were designed to handle. And 25% penetration rate against Moscow's most heavily defended airspace is not a failure metric. Against targets of sufficient strategic value, 25% means the mission succeeds. The Russian military knows this. Their own analysts published a response to the Rzeszow unveiling within 48 hours. Russian analysts responded to the unveiling of Ukraine's FP-9 missile with language more revealing than they may have intended. Their public assessment said Russia does possess systems theoretically capable of intercepting it. They named the S-300 and S-400 air defense families, using 48N6 and 40N6 interceptor missiles. According to that analysis, those systems could potentially engage the FP-9 in the upper portion of its flight path or during the boost phase shortly after launch. That statement matters for one reason above all others. It is not dismissal. It is admission. Russia did not claim the FP-9 was propaganda. It did not call the specifications fake. It did not say the missile was irrelevant or easily neutralized. Instead, Russian analysts immediately moved to the technical problem of how to defend against it. That shift says everything. When militaries face a threat they do not take seriously, they mock it. When they face a threat they recognize, they begin discussing radar coverage, engagement windows, interceptor types, and deployment geometry. That is exactly what happened here. Read the details carefully. They emphasized the need for early warning radars near potential launch zones. They stressed the importance of maximum tracking time. They highlighted boost phase interception, which means detecting a launch within seconds and responding almost instantly. Those are not signs of confidence. Those are signs of difficulty. Boost phase interception is one of the hardest forms of missile defense. It requires near-perfect awareness, rapid command decisions, and interceptors already positioned in the right places. Miss the first window and the target accelerates, climbs, and becomes harder to engage later. Even advanced air defense systems can struggle when geography, timing, and saturation are working against them. So Russia's response was less a reassurance than a calculation. How many radars are needed? Where should they be placed? How many interceptor batteries must be moved inward? Which regions become priorities? What assets must now be defended that were previously considered safe because of distance? That is the real strategic cost of the FP-9. Even before launch, it forces resource diversion. Missile defense is expensive. Interceptors are costly. Radar networks require crews, maintenance, and integration. Batteries moved to defend rear area infrastructure cannot simultaneously reinforce frontline sectors. Every new threat creates choices, and choices create vulnerabilities elsewhere. And the FP-9 is not even the endpoint. It is simply the most visible point on a development curve that keeps advancing. Firepoint, the Ukrainian company behind the missile, says the FP-7 short-range ballistic missile is already in testing and can be used to a limited extent while the FP-9 enters serial production this summer. That means two systems moving at once, one nearing production, one already progressing through trials. This is where traditional defense thinking begins to fail. Most legacy contractors operate on long procurement cycles. One program moves through design, testing, revision, funding approval, and eventual fielding over many years. Firepoint appears to be operating on a wartime innovation model instead. Multiple weapons in parallel, rapid iteration, continuous feedback from battlefield use. Direct adaptation based on what the enemy changes next. That process can be more dangerous than any single missile because it compounds over time. Russia may adapt to one system, only to face another optimized around the countermeasure. And another pressure point is emerging beyond Ukraine itself. The United Kingdom's Project Nightfall introduces a second axis of strategic strain. While Ukrainian firms accelerate domestic strike capability, outside partners are also exploring new technologies, support systems, and unconventional methods that could further complicate Russia's defense planning. This creates a layered problem for Moscow. It is not just one missile. It is not just one factory. It is not just one front. The deep strike drones have already hit targets in Tatarstan, Bashkortostan, and the Caspian Sea region. The Samara oil blending station burned. The Nizhny Tagil tank factory was struck at 1,800 kilometers. There is no Russian city, no industrial complex, no military production facility anywhere in the country that sits safely outside the range envelope of weapons Ukraine either already deploys or will deploy before the end of 2026. The Kremlin is not an abstract symbol in this context. It is a specific building at a specific coordinate. The distance from Ukrainian-controlled territory to that coordinate is approximately 750 kilometers. The FP-9's maximum range is 855 kilometers. Ukrainian defense analyst David Axe said it directly. Putin might now face the prospect of strikes aimed at him personally in retaliation for Russia's many attempts to eliminate Zelensky. Ukraine might now have the capability to target Putin himself, as well as the chance to throttle Russian industry and its economy. But most importantly, the missile will allow Ukraine to strike critical sites in Russia, from airfields to command centers, oil refineries, and military-industrial areas, without having to seek permission of Western countries, without permission. That is the transformational element that every previous Ukrainian long-range capability lacked. Storm Shadow requires British authorization. ATAC-CMS required American authorization. Every Western-supplied weapon came with political constraints that Russia learned to calculate into its strategic planning. If the constraint was not lifted, Russia could operate freely within the protected envelope. Ukraine's domestic missile program eliminates that constraint entirely. The Flamingo does not need Washington's approval. The FP9 does not need London's sign-off. They are Ukrainian weapons, authorized by Ukrainian commanders, targeting Russian military facilities that have been killing Ukrainian civilians for 4 years. The Russia that started this war, believing Ukraine could never build what it is now building, is facing a 2026 in which Ukrainian missiles are hitting factories at 1,400 kilometers, a hypersonic range ballistic missile entering serial production with Moscow range, a British project delivering 500-kilometer ground-launched ballistic missiles within 12 months, and a $50 billion defense industry producing all of them simultaneously while training the engineers for the next generation. The Stone Age reference is not hyperbole. It is the strategic logic of what Ukraine's missile campaign is targeting. Oil refineries, power infrastructure, ammunition factories, tank production plants, the industrial nodes that convert Russian raw materials and human labor into the weapons that sustain the invasion. Destroy enough of them with sufficient sustained precision, and the war machine does not have the fuel, the shells, the tanks, or the replacement vehicles to continue its operations at the current scale. Russia built its invasion on the assumption that it could reach all of Ukraine while remaining safely beyond Ukraine's reach. That assumption is gone. The FP9, standing in an exhibition hall in Rzeszów on April 27th, is the most visible proof of its absence. It is a growing network of innovation, moving faster than traditional military planning cycles. Russia can calculate how to stop a known weapon. It is far harder to calculate against an opponent whose next capability may already be in testing. That may be the most important message hidden inside the analysts' response. They were not describing victory. They were describing the cost of trying to keep up. Under Project Nightfall, the UK has launched a competition to rapidly develop ground-launched ballistic missiles with a range of more than 500 kilometers, designed to operate in high-threat battlefields with heavy electromagnetic interference. Nightfall missiles will be capable of being launched from a range of vehicles, firing multiple missiles in quick succession and withdrawing within minutes, allowing Ukrainian forces to hit key military targets before Russian forces can respond. With a 200-kilo conventional high-explosive warhead, high precision, a production rate of 10 systems per month, and a maximum price of $800,000 per missile, Nightfall is intended to provide Ukraine with a powerful, cost-effective long-range strike option. 800,000 pounds per missile, 10 systems per month entering production. Launched from vehicles that fire and immediately relocate before Russian counter-battery systems can respond. The Nightfall brings British industrial capacity into the long-range strike picture at a price point that makes sustained high-volume use financially viable. $800,000 is expensive by drone standards, but is a fraction of the cost of the Russian defense systems it would penetrate and destroy. Now layer all of these programs on top of each other simultaneously. The Flamingo with 3,000-kilometer range and 1,000-kilogram payload, already used in combat against Votkinsk. The FP5 cruise missile in active production. The FP7 ballistic missile in testing. The FP9 hypersonic range ballistic missile entering serial production this summer with Moscow range confirmed. The Peklo missile drone with 700-kilometer range already delivered to Ukrainian forces. The Palyanitsia in serial production. The UK Nightfall entering development contract phase with first test firings within 12 months. Storm Shadow and ATAC-CMS already operational with expanded authorization. A Ukrainian security source said the deep strike capability of Ukraine's missile arsenal in conjunction with long-range drones would allow Kyiv to confront Russian air defenses with a bewildering multi-layered tapestry of airborne attack deep within Russia itself. Bewildering? Multi-layered? That is the operational concept that makes the individual capabilities of each system less important than their combined effect. Russia's air defense network around Moscow was designed to handle a specific threat profile. The Flamingo approaches at subsonic cruise missile speed from one direction. The FP9 arrives at Mach 6.5 on a ballistic trajectory from another. The Peklo flies at 700 kilometers per hour on a low observable profile. The long-range drones arrive in waves of dozens simultaneously from multiple vectors. Each one individually might be intercepted. All of them together, arriving simultaneously, force the radar and intercept systems to prioritize among threats it was never designed to handle concurrently. Ukraine's long-range arsenal expands Russia's challenge. Russia's limited air defenses will be stretched thinner and thinner. The end goal is to transform Russia's vastness from an asset into a liability. Russia's vastness as a liability. That phrase captures the strategic reversal that Ukraine's missile program is achieving. For 2 years, Putin's calculation was that depth equals safety. Move the factories to the Urals. Keep the command infrastructure near Moscow. Build the oil export terminals in the Baltic. Put the ammunition depots in Saratov. The distance itself was the defense. Ukraine cannot reach what it cannot touch. Ukraine responded by building the reach. The Flamingo reached Votkinsk at 1,400 kilometers. The FP9 reaches Moscow at 750 kilometers.